Welcome to My Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. We dip into the past to make new memories as well. Well, what a day it is today. We've got him back. Quincy Stringham, historian, author, musician, Woodstock vet. And by the way, his first episode with us is still the most viewed of My Boomer Buddies podcast. Quincy Stringham, welcome back. So glad to have you.
Glad to be back on this cold day in Chicago. Although not as cold as the last few days, so it feels like spring. It's up to 13.
Yes. And speaking of the cold, I'm up in Minneapolis. It's cold here too. We are going to talk about the day the music died, because it's coming up, the 65th anniversary of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper crashing in that airplane. Quincy, you've got some knowledge with that. If you don't mind, let's get started and talk about the Winter Dance Party.
Okay, it's a good time of year to do that since the anniversary is right around the corner.
What are your memories of the Winter Dance Party, the original 1959?
Well, my memories, I was 9 years old. I was a first grade rocker. I mean, I took to it early. And so I got involved listening to rock and roll music in about 1956. The early rockers, Buddy was my guy. I just liked the sound. It was he and Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, and surprisingly Elvis to a lesser degree. But Buddy Holly was the guy in my opinion. I think it was the guitars. You could hear it. And I liked the guitar sound. I think that's what it was. It was very melodic, and I liked it. He spoke to me, and I just happened to have all the 45s from Buddy. There were several because he had a number of hits. But I also had, at the time of the crash, I had the Richie Valens 45 of Donna with La Bamba on the B side of all things. It's a hell of a 45, right?
Yeah, it is.
And Delphi Records with a light green label, and I had Chantilly Lace from the Big Bopper on Mercury. And so I actually had their 45s too. So I was ninth grade. I was in fifth grade. And my recollection is of the day. It was a cold, winter morning in suburban New York City, outside 20 miles outside of Manhattan. And my assignment that morning in the class was we had the old tall windows with a pole with a hook on the top that you stick the hook in the top of the window and pull it down.
Yeah.
And my job that morning was to open the windows or, to get a little fresh air in the room. And I was back there opening the windows, and one of my classmates came up to me and said, "Did you hear about the plane crash?" Which I hadn't heard yet. And he told me, and I just remember being in shock. And it really hit me hard. And it was just, I think part of it was because these guys were my heroes, especially Buddy. And in reflection later on, as an adult looking back on it, I think it was a combination of the music and the fact that these guys were my heroes, and the fact that this was probably the first person that I knew in my immediate, people I paid attention to that had died. And the fact that these guys were like 22 years old, 24, 17, 22, and 26. I mean, they were just a few years older than me. It wasn't like, your grandparents or, or, an older relative or something. This was somebody, young like me. And it was the first one that I'd been hit with a death of an actual person. And I think that was more of an adult reflection back, thinking back about it. But that's what I remember. And I've always kind of related to Don McLean on American Pie with, I can't remember if I cried when I heard about his widowed bride, but something touched me deep inside the day the music died. Because he was sitting there, he read it in his hometown paper that he was sitting there folding, when you get the papers, he was folding them up so he could throw them on the porch. Because like 2 years after that, I lived 5 miles from Don McLean. He lived in New Rochelle. I just lived the next town over. And 2 years later, I delivered the afternoon papers. Oh. So I know exactly what he was talking about because they dumped the papers on a street corner, and you sit there on the curb and you'd fold the paper in thirds so you could pitch it up in fairly close proximity to the front porch. as you rode by on your bicycle. So I know exactly what he was doing. So that line always resonated with me, just because of my own experiences a couple of years later. So it's a
Sure.
paper boy. So
And that song itself made a lot of people try to figure out what he meant by the lyrics.
oh
And
yeah, right,
that
right.
could be another.
That's a whole nother
So
show.
so the winter dance party, this frigid weather that we're in right now, it was like that
It's just
way
just
back
like
then.
that. Plus with snow.
Yeah. So
And,
what do you
and
know about the actual winter dance party?
Buddy Holly had gotten married to Maria Elena Santiago from New York City. She was a Puerto Rican young lady, a few years older than Buddy, who worked at Southern Music Publishing, which was the publishing house that handled Buddy Holly and his songs. And they went there that one day, and they were in New York, and they went to the office, and it was love at first sight. And I've heard this story. I became friends with Maria Elena over the years through my association with the Latter Day Winter Dance Party group that toured, which I think we're going to talk about later.
Yep.
Uh, I had the opportunity to travel for 5 days in the same van as driving Maria Elena around the Midwest on tour with us. So I got all the stories firsthand from her. And he walked in and basically fell in love with her at first sight. Uh, and that night they went to dinner at the Howard Johnson's just off of Broadway in Times Square, and he informed her that he brought her flowers and said that we're going to get married. And she just thought it was a joke. She just thought he was just joking around, and so she said, "Well, tell you what, if you're serious, I have to tell my aunt." She lived with her aunt, who was the head of Latin American music at Southern Publishing. She says, "I have to." She lived with her. She says, "I have to tell my aunt, and if you're serious about this, then you come to the apartment tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and you have to talk to my aunt." Thinking that, of course, he was just kidding and he would never show up. So the next morning, 9 o'clock, the doorman called up and says, "There's a young man down here to see you." So she says, "Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh." He was serious. So she let him up, and Buddy came and talked to the aunt, and she got begrudging permission, shall we say, and they got married shortly thereafter. Anyway, unfortunately, he took Maria Elena down to Lubbock in West Texas, and this was 1958, and this was like totally, outside her frame of reference down there, and she also had a business. Had been working in the music publishing business, so she knew a little bit about the business end of this. And she got looking around and was down. She says, there's really many opportunities that you're not taking advantage of. And bottom line is, they got married, and he moved to New York. He wanted the Crickets come up, and they were going to go these new directions and expand out and start a publishing firm and a record label, this, that, and the other. And the Jerry Allison and the bass player was like,
Joe Malden.
didn't want to go. They got up there. They wanted to be back in Texas, so they didn't go, and the band kind of broke up. So now Buddy is living in Greenwich Village in an apartment with Maria Elena. Norman Petty is also, who's their producer down in Clovis, produced all the records, is not happy with the situation, and he, as would happen back in those days, he withheld money from Buddy, saying that, well, the money's all tied up and you've left, and this will have to take it to the attorneys, and I can't just be sending you money because you're not in the group anymore, sort of thing. Mm. So basically, he needed cash. He's living in New York. He's all these plans. He's taking guitar lessons. He's looking at other types of music, and he's running out of money. And so this offer came up for this crazy tour in the middle of January in the upper Midwest to go, and he needed the money, so he signed up, and along with Dion and the Belmonts and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper. Richie and all three of those guys had active hits; they were hit makers, and off they went. And so that was the background of it. It was not a tour he probably would have gone on had he had not been in financial straits. And to top it off, Maria Elena was pregnant with a child, so she often went with him on tour and would drive along in their car behind them, and they had a tan Cadillac. And he would either ride with Maria Elena or he would ride in the bus with the guys, and she would follow along behind where they had a driver. And but she was pregnant, so she stayed home this time. And that's the background. So off they went, and this thing was really poorly engineered. It was a logistical nightmare of crisscrossing, backtracking, lots of extra miles that were really unnecessary if it had been planned properly in the middle of January. You know, the equipment, it wasn't the luxurious tour buses of today. It was literally a school bus, actually a series of school buses, because they continually broke down, which resulted in the drummer Carl Bunch was hospitalized with frozen feet. They tried to burn some of the guys tried to burn newspapers in the aisle of the bus, which is not a good idea to keep warm. Dion wrote a song about it, about staying warm by his radiator in the hotel room at night after day in the cold, which he actually recorded on one of his latter day albums. So
the radiator,
the radiator, yeah. So that was kind of the background of the Winter Dance Party. So I don't know how much more you know.
Well, what I want to get to, we all know what happened.
Yeah.
The plane crashed, but can you help set the story straight on how people ended up on the plane and how people did not get on the plane?
Yeah.
There's a few different versions out there.
They're up in Clear Lake, Iowa, and their next stop is Fargo, North Dakota. The next night. Now that's between 300 and 400 miles. It's not an easy drive, and it's cold. And at this point, Big Bopper is sick. Richie Valens is lonely, cold. He's from San Fernando Valley. He's never seen snow in his life. You know, his kid is 17 years old. You know, he's like lonely. And the plan was that Buddy and Dion, one of the other guys, would go. Like Tommy was going to go. Tommy Alsop was their guitarist that they had hired, became a legendary producer down in Nashville. Subsequently, there was room in this small plane for a pilot, Buddy, and two other folk. But there was like 4 other people that could have gone. And so basically Dion looked at the price, which was $36 for a seat for them. And his dad paid $36 for rent in the Bronx, in their Bronx apartment. And he just couldn't justify $36 because he said $36 is like, you know, $400 in today's money. He said, I couldn't justify it. He says, I just couldn't do it. So he gave up his seat, and then Tommy Alsop flipped the coin and gave up his seat to Richie Valens, and Richie Valens won the flip. And so Tommy stayed off, and Dion gave his seat to the Big Bopper, and how those 3 ended up on the plane. So his Buddy, the Big Bopper, and Richie took off on the plane, and they took off on the plane. It was a whiteout night, and I've seen several of those whiteout nights in Iowa as I was replicating this tour with this latter day Winter Dance Party, and you cannot tell. It's all white. You cannot tell where the horizon is at all. It's just there's no differentiation. And to top it off, the pilot was a 21-year-old kid who was not qualified to fly with instruments at night, and he was the pilot. And he thought he was going up, and he was going down. And he flew straight. They took off from Clear Lake. We're like midnight. We're in the air for 4 minutes and flew right into the ground in the middle of the cornfield. Where today there's a wrought iron statue built by a gentleman in Green Bay, and it's an homage place. People go and leave guitar picks, flowers to this day. I've been there, and you have to walk through the cornfields. You don't drive up and get out. You've got to take a hike through the field to get there. Climb over a couple of fences, but it was worth a little bit of a trek to get out to it. So,
thus, the day the music died.
The music died, right?
And Dion in that documentary that you had me watch. He said he'll say it was actually when the music started.
Yeah,
Rock and roll exploded. So,
right, right.
well, that brings me now, Quincy, to the John Mueller Winter Dance Party, which you were a part of for what, 8 years?
8 or 9 years, right?
8 or 9 years. And I got to see that show. You were gracious enough to invite Sharon and myself to the St. Cloud show, and it replicated a lot of the cities that the Winter Dance Party of 1959 went on. So, can you touch on that a little bit? What was that experience like?
That was one of those things that was like my 40s, and I always had played in rock and roll bands and played guitar, and the typical garage band guy, right?
Mhm.
Was not a professional musician, but I always kept you know, my finger in it.
Mhm.
While I had actually a real job,
Yeah.
and 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 uh, uh, and one I have a friend on the West Coast, music buddy by the name of Scott, who got to be friends with John Mueller, who was playing the buddy role at the show that was on Broadway. It was played for like 15 years in London,
Mm.
and right in the London Theater District, and then it played on Broadway for about a year and a half. And I saw it there like several times because I was in New York a lot on business in those days, and every time I'd go, I'd take one of my people that worked for me. I'd say, "Hey, I got a show for you to see," and I'd take them to go see Buddy. So I think I probably saw the show half dozen times, including its last performance, which was really
Wow.
cool. They just kept jamming at the end. They just kept playing. It was so cool. They had a jam session. It was so much fun. Anyway, so this show, John was playing Buddy in the Los Angeles company, and also then subsequently the San Diego company of the show. So he had a nice run down in Southern California, and he got to be friends with my friend Scott, and they got to talking about, this is all great, but it's a 2.5 hour show, and the music is interspersed all through it. But a lot of it is, it's non musical. It's dialogue, telling the story, telling Buddy's story, which is a really fun story. But that the music is really the highlight of the show.
Sure.
And they said, wouldn't it be fun if we just kind of forgot all the dialogue part and just did a 2.5 hour concert and maybe expand it out and add the Bopper and Richie to it? And they thought this was a great idea. So they started looking around and they recruited some really talented musicians who loved the music. And they just said, they kind of, it was a labor of love. I mean, none of these guys did it to get rich. They just thought it was a really cool thing to do. And, and they ultimately recruited J.P. Richardson Jr., which J.P. Richardson is the Big Bopper's name, who's lived in Houston, where his dad was from, Beaumont, Texas, actually. And they recruited J.P. Jr. To eventually take the role on of his dad. And it was really spooky because he was his dad. I mean, the guy is, it was like it was too close, man. I mean,
Hmm.
he just looked just like him and had the mannerisms and the voice. It was great. And we got a gentleman by the name of Ray Anthony out of Las Vegas who did a lot of the legend shows in Vegas. He did everybody from Elvis to Richie Valens to all sorts of people. But he had all the Richie Valens stuff down pat. He had it down. He knew it all by heart. So these three were the three principles of this thing. Well, these guys went out. They actually had different guys playing the Bopper and Richie on the first time we went out, and I wasn't involved. But John and Scott put this together with some other folk, and they went out in January, and they went to the exact same locations on the exact same days as the actual Winter Dance Party tour in 1959. And in many cases, the venues still existed, and and they they pretty much sold out everywhere they went. They went out for like 3 weeks. They pretty much sold out everywhere they went, and they raised almost $100,000 uh, for music programs at high schools along the way.
Hmm.
So they actually did, they did good deeds along the way too. And they had a ball, except that the logistics were crazy
Yeah.
because they backtracked. It was not efficient at all. They had way too many miles and they did not go on in a yellow school bus. They upgraded the transportation.
That's my next question.
Yeah, it was they had air conditioning and heating and all that sort of stuff. It didn't have retread tires and the whole thing. So So it's a little bit better that way, but it still wasn't. It still wasn't the luxury tour bus. You know, it was like big 9-passenger vans and equipment trucks and this, that, and the other, with the sound trucks and all that stuff. So, so they did this and they survived, but they said, you know, this was really fun. We can actually make this into a viable project if we did it in a more logical, business-like fashion,
Yeah.
which is where I came in. So Scott calls me. Scott and I get in touch with each other, and I had just left corporate America. I was working for myself. I had some flexibility in my schedule, and he says, Quincy, he says, you're the guy that I need to have on this thing. He says, I need you to come with me on. We're going to do this again in the summer up in the Midwest. Well, he got me. You know, it was an easier sell because it was the middle of July and August. You know, it wasn't January.
Yeah.
And he said, we're going to go out for like 10 or 12 days, and you need to come because I'm surrounded by all these crazy musicians. He says, and I need somebody with a business brain, but who also knows the music and can play and knows all the songs. He says, you are the guy. He says, you are the guy for this. You have to come. I said, I really don't have time, Scott. I'm trying to get my new business off the ground. And he says, you know, 20 years from now, you're not going to know what you're not going to remember what you did those 10 days if you don't come with me. But if you come with me, you'll always remember that. And I thought, you know, he's right. And here I am, was I 40, early 40s, something like that. And this is my chance to go on the road with a rock and roll band. Actually go on the road for like 2 weeks. I said, okay, I got to do it. So off we went. So I flew up to Michigan and met him in Grand Rapids, Michigan for our first gig. And I thought, well, I'll do it this one time. And I'll get it out of my system. It'll be fun. And I'm not quite sure what they're going to have me do, but I'll just do whatever needs to be done. So I did it for 9 years.
And eventually you ended up doing it in the cold weather.
Oh yeah, well the next one after that summer, when they teased me in with the summer, when they said, oh well, the one after this we're going back in January and doing it again, but we're going to do it in a logical fashion. I said, oh, okay, but I had such a good time. I decided, oh well, okay, I'll take my long underwear and we'll just do it. So I ended up being, Scott and I were kind of the front men on this. We were the logistics operational guys, you know. And I ended up doing all the merchandising because that was my background, and working the front of the house, working with the house on the, you know, when I'd get there, I'd work the front with all the venue and making sure everything was set and getting the merchandise all set up and just taking all the logistics in the front. And Scott would be doing stuff more in the back, and then the guys would come in and do their sound check, and then at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, we did the show. And you know, there were days where I thought, it was, you know, 10 degrees in Fargo, North Dakota, and I'm up there going, or Duluth, Minnesota, and I'm going, what on earth am I doing here? You know, what's this crazy? About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or as I'm driving across the plains of northern Minnesota, and then the music would start, and I go, oh, that's why I'm here. Every night I got the shot of adrenaline that got me into the next day. And I did it for 9 years. I made some wonderful friends along the way. I got to meet all sorts of people whose records I bought, you know, because they'd come and they'd see the show, or sometimes they'd do a guest appearance. Bobby V, for instance, you know, people like that. It was, I got to know Maria Elena. I got to know the entire Holly family. We went down and played the Buddy Holly Music Festival in Clovis, New Mexico, in Lubbock, Texas, every September around his birthday, and met all sorts of people that came and played at that festival. You know, that again, who, you know, and we'd hang around the hospitality room at night and just play and play and play into the early hours. You know, sitting there next to some guy whose record I have. You know, I'm sitting there playing guitar with him. You know, and Buddy's Buddy's two brothers are over in the corner with their guitars playing. I mean, it was just magical. I couldn't, you know, I would have paid big money to do this, and I actually got paid to do it. You know.
And you showed me a picture, you were in the Norman Petty studio.
Yeah. Well, we did
with them.
This thing led this project that we were on led to a couple of recordings that we did, a couple of CDs that we did. One was called "Stay All Night," which was Buddy Holly's Country Roots, which was all the songs that they played growing up before rock and roll was invented. And this was the two brothers, Travis and Larry Holly, were sitting there playing all these old Hank Williams songs and Ernest Tubb songs. And we just play along with them and say, what do you want to play next, Larry? And they'd say it, and they'd say, what key do you want to play? And they said, well, why don't we try it in D? Well, they played everything in D, but we'd always ask them just to see if
Yeah,
they'd ever
yeah.
change. They'd never changed. It was always, well, let's try this one in D. So we played it in D. And but we're sitting there, and one of the musicians, it's actually Robert Reynolds from the Mavericks, leans over and says to Scott and I, this is like historical. This should be recorded while these guys are still able to do it. Because these guys were all in their 60s and 70s at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, well, sure. Anyway, so we got these guys. They all came to Tommy Allsup's studio outside in Fort Worth, and we recorded the Stay All Night album, all this traditional music that they grew up with. And it was so then we presented it at the next Buddy Holly music festival in Lubbock that fall, and yeah. So then we did it again. We did another one when we played more 50s stuff 2 years later, and we actually recorded that in the Clovis studio, in Norman Petty's Clovis Studios. The first time it had been used for recording in like 25 years.
Oh man!
And we had to convince them. It was under a trust at the Baptist church down there. We had to convince them that we weren't AC/DC or, coming in and going to trash the place. And they were all really very tame at this point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so we went down there and recorded down there. And what happened was, so we were waiting for the recordings to start working, and the drummer plane was delayed. And you had to fly to Dallas and then to Lubbock, and then you had to get in the car and drive 90 miles to Clovis. So it wasn't like flying from New York to Chicago. There was a few travel challenges to get there. So anyway, he was a couple hours late, and everybody else is sitting there waiting. So somebody looks at me and said, hey, you play the drums, right? And I said, well, I play at the drums. I mean, I play the guitar, but I play at the drums. I said, well, yeah. He said, get in there, because we're tired of waiting. I go, okay. So I sat in there and played the drums with these guys.
Oh,
and
man.
so I threw somebody my camera, because there I'm sitting there, Tommy Allsup sitting in front of me, and they're playing It's So Easy by Buddy Holly. And he actually played the lead guitar licks on that song, on the hit record in 1958, in that studio, that same room.
And you're sitting in on drums with him.
And I'm playing the drums. So I threw my camera. This was before cell phones. So this was when you actually had the little portable cameras. I threw the camera across the room to a guy standing there. Take my picture, because nobody's going to believe the story if I don't have a picture. So I have photographic evidence of it. So I think the band was really happy when the drummer showed up, though. And so was I.
Oh man, you lived a dream. Oh man. I have to say one thing. The John Mueller Winter Dance Party is the real deal. It's so good. Maria Elena Hawley gave the blessing to him.
Yeah,
John Mueller, right?
She said she's the one that this show it makes it very emotional every time she sees it. She traveled with us one year. She came on the road with us for about 5 days, and kind of the highlight of the trip every year was Green Bay, Wisconsin. And we played at Riverside Ballroom, played 3 nights there, about 1,200 people, sold out every night. And it was a place they played, the actual band played in 1959, the day before they went to Clear Lake. So it was 24 hours before they were killed in the plane crash. They played at this venue. So we're up there, and we start to play True Love Ways, which is Buddy's song he wrote for Maria Elena, and Maria Elena and I and several are standing in the wings of the stage, just watching. And the Big Bopper came over, and John's out there starting the song, and the Big Bopper comes over, and he takes Maria by the arm. This was not planned. This was spontaneous, and he took her by the arm and led her out on stage, and took her up to John, and they just played an instrumental. They broke into the instrumental, and John and Maria Elena danced to it. Oh. There was not a dry eye in the house, including John and Maria Elena's. It was one of the most, it sounds like a Hollywood, made up thing, but it was real. And it was the entire audience. There was you couldn't hear, you could have heard a pin drop. It was really, really moving, emotional things. And, had some really interesting experiences. But I got to ride with Maria Elena for like 5 days in the van. I was driving, and she was my co-pilot, and Mark, the drummer, was in the back seat. And so the 3 of us were driving across the plains, and man, she was like this Energizer buddy. She was great. She is great. Still going strong. And I just kind of flipped the switch on her, and she'd just start talking. and she'd tell me all the stories, man. And I got to hear it, right from her mouth.
Oh, how
It was.
wonderful
I
for
mean, how
you.
you couldn't pay for that, right?
No.
I mean, he was friends with the Everly Brothers, really close friends with the Everly Brothers, and of all people, Little Richard. Who would think Buddy Holly and Little Richard were friends? But they were.
Huh.
And it's just all these stories from back then, and yeah, it was great. She said,
Dan
She said, Buddy carried a gun with him, and he had a little 22. She said, he carried a gun because oftentimes we got paid in cash. He said, so we were traveling, in a car by ourselves with thousands of dollars, and so you had to, this was 1950s. So he says, he never used it, had to use it, but he had it. So
Yeah. Dion DiMucci, in his documentary, said he was really close with Buddy, and
right,
yeah. Dion can really play that guitar.
Yeah, he's great. He's great. I've seen him. He's 80 years old, and he's still rocking. I mean, you look him up online now, and he's playing a lot of blues. Kind of both acoustic and electrified blues. He's very talented. He's not just run around Sue.
Right.
I mean, the guy is an incredible musician.
He kept the guys preoccupied on that cold bus.
Yeah. So here you had a guy from the Bronx, New York, and a guy from Lubbock, Texas. And I mean, you wouldn't put those two together, but they became close friends. Here's another story. They had an event in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They have a thing called the Legendary Master Series that they do. They award it to a seminal artist every year, like a Hank Williams or a Sam Cooke or people of that magnitude. Well, Buddy Holly was awarded it one year, probably about 2006 or 7, thereabouts. And they selected our Winter Dance Party band to go play at the concert in Cleveland for this presentation. And there were people on the bill like John Mellencamp, Nancy Griffith, the Crickets. I mean, it wasn't just the local garage band guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was the Drifters. Now, again, why would the Drifters be on there with the Buddy Holly thing? Well, one of the original guys from the Drifters got up and said, "You may be wondering why the Drifters are here." He says, "The reason is we toured with Buddy Holly and the Crickets early on, and in one of those package tours. Now this is the 50s." He says, "We couldn't eat same place everybody else could eat. We couldn't stay the same place everybody else could stay." Drifters, I think you probably all know, was a doo-wop / R&B group, a black group from the, had up on Broadway and Up on the Roof and songs like that.
Yeah.
Great talent. But Buddy made it clear that he would not eat in any place that wouldn't serve the Drifters, and he would not stay in any place that would not put the Drifters up. He says you have to realize this was a 21-year-old guy from Lubbock, Texas. He says in 1957 and 58, making those kind of things. He says unheard of.
Yeah.
He says, and I never forgot it. I never forgot what a gentleman he was,
and wise for his years.
Yeah. He said that's why we're here, to honor him and remember him.
That's wonderful.
So I thought that was a great story.
Yeah. Well, the John Mueller Winter Dance Party, they're still touring. If you go on the internet and just type in John Mueller's Winter Dance Party, you'll see. He actually goes all over the country now. I had the pleasure, along with my wife, to see them in St. Cloud, Quincy, when you were handling the merchandising and all that. And I remember being in this little small theater in St. Cloud, and what atmosphere that was, what a rockin' joint that was, and the energy was really up there. And one of the guys that came on and performed was a guy that I saw on CMT television, this young kid named Kevin Montgomery.
Right.
And I had bought his CD, right? And here he is up there, and his pedigree is that his dad grew up with Buddy. They were musical buddies together. And his mom sang on some of Elvis's songs, like Kentucky Rain, Suspicious Minds, and In the Ghetto. But here's this young guy up there with this beautiful voice up there. And what a surprise it was that he was part of that tour.
Yeah, we set Kevin up to be the opening act for us. And again, you wouldn't think that on the surface, it doesn't. Why would he be on the opening act? But it's because of his connections. The buddies first group was called Buddy and Bob, and his dad's Bob Montgomery,
Sure.
and they were quite the hit down in the Lubbock area back when they were teenagers. And Bob went on to Nashville and became a very, very successful music producer in Nashville,
Hmm.
and a very, very well known one. And Kevin is his son, and he came and we had a great time with him. He'd get up and do his thing, and he just became part of the group. We just had hang out every night.
His
His
music
great
is
music, yeah,
really, really good.
yeah,
Really
right,
good.
right,
Yeah, but this unknown kid with a cool haircut that I saw on TV a few years before, and I
yeah,
remember I went up and talked to him afterwards, and I said, "Yeah, I've got your CD, Fear Nothing." And he goes, "Oh, you're the one that bought it."
yeah,
And it was 4 below, by the way, in St. Cloud that night.
yeah, yeah,
And I remember afterwards, after the show, he didn't really have a proper coat on, but
right,
he did have a scarf around his throat and everything, and just a nice guy. But
yeah,
you get to experience so many cool things, and
yeah,
that's one little thing I got to experience. But you every night had something happen, and
yeah.
man, wow, Buddy Holly legacy lives on. You got to experience it down well across the upper Midwest, and then down in Texas and in New
Right.
Mexico. Do you have any closing notes here? We're gonna wrap this up. You could probably go on and on and on, and maybe another
Yeah,
time we could do that. But
there's plenty.
Quincy, sum it up. What was it like being part of the whole Buddy Holly world?
It was one of the coolest things in my life. I just it spoke to me from a young age. The first time the first time I decided I want to play the electric guitar was literally. I remember the moment it was 1958, so I was again 9 years older thereabouts. I was doing my schoolwork in the hallway, a little table in the hallway we set up that had a window that overlooked the front street, so I could see all the action on the street, making sure I wasn't missing anything going out on the street. And that's where I do my homework, and had the radio, of course, going on, and I'd heard the song before, but for some reason that day Peggy Sue came on, and there's the famous guitar break in the middle of Peggy Sue, and it's a rhythm guitar break. It's not a fancy
Yeah.
lead guitar; it's a rhythm guitar break. But it just shot through me like an electric current that day,
Mm-hmm.
and I just thought I want to know how to do that, and I did. That was the song that did it for me. I've got to meet wonderful people. I've got to learn. I can play all the Buddy Holly songs. I got to play with these guys. We play at sound check, and I sit around in hotel rooms and play with these guys, and I learned a ton of stuff. How'd you do that? Show me that lick. How'd you do that? Oh man, that's so cool. That sort of thing. It was a real tutorial for me too, and raised my playing level significantly. Over the years. But it's just been it's contributed so much to my life, and it has led to obviously other musical experiences too. They're all interrelated with it. So it's been really important for me.
You got to be plugged into the roots of rock and roll
Right,
and
right,
get a
right.
front seat view of it. What a charmed boomer life you have lived, and you got more you're doing now. Don't let me say that
Yeah,
you're done living it. I mean that Woodstock, so many other things. You're writing memoirs, which is a personal thing for you, but you're really good at it. Quincy, I want to have you back on again, Boomer Buddies, and we can maybe talk some history. I know you're not just a music guy. You know a lot about World War II, and some of the other Boomer Buddies are plugged into that as well. So I just want to tell the audience, check out my Boomer Buddies podcast on YouTube. The videos are up there. There's quite a few of them. Check them all out. All the buddies have something to offer. We're also on Spotify, and we're on Buzzsprout and Apple Podcasts. So, Quincy, thank you so much for being on. I look forward already to the next time we're together. And we'll probably bring one of the other buds on to be with you. I know you've been on with Bill before, and that was a great show as well. So,
so
on
okay, it was fun.
behalf of you, Quincy Stringham, and all the Boomer Buddies, thank you to the listeners and viewers out there. Until next time, I'm Rick Reed, and we will see you around the block.